Yes, past perfect continuous tense എന്താണെന്ന് എൻ്റെ തൊട്ട് മുമ്പ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള വീഡിയോയിൽ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഇനി പാസ്റ്റ് പെർഫെക്റ്റ് കണ്ടിന്യൂസ് ടെൻസിൽ നമുക്ക് ആ 14 തരം ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ചോദിക്കാം. ഫസ്റ്റ് വൺ ഈസ് വാട്ട് ഹാഡ് യു ബീൻ ഡൂയിങ്? നിങ്ങൾ കുറച്ചു കാലം മുമ്പ് ഒരു സമയം തൊട്ട് നിശ്ചിത സമയം വരെ വാട്ട് ഹാഡ് യു ബീൻ ഡൂയിങ്? I had been training in a college. Where had you been training? Where had you been training? നിങ്ങൾ എവിടെയാണ് ആ കാലത്ത് ട്രെയിനിങ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? I had been training some students in Trivandrum. ട്രിവാൻഡ്രത്താണ് ഞാൻ ട്രെയിനിങ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്. When had you been training the students? When had you been giving training to them? When had you been training them? I had been training them from 2010 to 2020. That means for 10 years I had been training them. Who had been training? Who had been training them? ആരായിരുന്നു അവരെ ട്രെയിൻ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? ആരാണ് അവരെ അത്രയും കാലം ട്രെയിൻ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? Who had been teaching them? I had been teaching them. He or Mrs. Ladika teacher had been teaching them. She had been teaching them. Okay, who and whom? Whom had you been consulting all these years? From a particular time to particular time, you were very sick. Then, whom had you been consulting? I had been consulting Dr. Narayan Kuti. I had been consulting a physiotherapist. I had been consulting whom? From whom? ആരിൽ നിന്ന്? From whom had you been borrowing money? ആരിൽ നിന്നാണ് നിങ്ങൾ ആ പർട്ടിക്കുലർ സമയത്ത് പണം വാങ്ങിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? അതുപോലെ for whom? For whom had you been sending all this money? ഈ പണം അയച്ചു കൊടുത്തത് for whom had you been sending money? Okay, so that is about who, whom and which person had you been training? Which person had you been meeting? Which book had you been reading? Which place had you been visiting? That is about which. Whose book had you been reading all those days? Whose book? ആരുടെ പുസ്തകം? Whose book? Okay, whose pen had you been using to write with? Whose book had you been reading? That is whose. Then where had you been visiting? I had been visiting the northern states of India. I had been visiting all those places in that particular period. How had you visiting in those area? Or how had you giving coaching to the students? I had been visiting in a train or by plane, by car. I had been visiting all these places by car. How? Then how many? How many persons had been accompanying you? How many persons had been accompanying you? Then how many books had you been reading? How much energy had you been spoiling all these days? How much energy had you been spending for that project? How much power had you been exerted for that project? എത്ര എനർജി നിങ്ങൾ ചെലവാക്കി? I had been exerting much energy. That is how much എന്ന് ചോദിക്കുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ ക്വാണ്ടിറ്റി ഇല്ല, അളവേ പറയാൻ പറ്റൂ. ഓക്കെ, മച്ച്. Then how long had you been there? നിങ്ങൾ ആ നിശ്ചിത സമയത്തിനിടയ്ക്ക് എത്ര കാലം അവിടെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു? So we had been living there for 10 years from 2010. We had been staying there for 5 years. Okay, right. So that is about how long. How often had you been visiting your old parents those days? How often had you spending time with them? How often had you been visiting some of your old friends? How often? എത്ര തവണ? Then how far had you been walking in those days? How far had you been walking early in the morning those days? How far had you been running? How far had you been running your bike in those days? How far? And how far talks about distance. So this way, dears, we can talk about WH and H questions in past perfect continuous tense. From a particular time to a particular time, what had you been doing? What had they been doing? Or before an incident, before your marriage, with whom had you been living? ആരുടെ കൂടെയായിരുന്നു നിങ്ങൾ ജീവിച്ചുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? Before your marriage. Before your marriage. Or before you met her. Before you met her, with whom had you been consulting? ആരെയാണ് കൺസൾട്ട് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത്? So such a way we can ask all these sort of questions.